Welcome, everybody. My name is Jonathan Chaplain. I'm from St. Paul's Church, and I've been convening this series of evening lectures on faith and empowerment. It's a great pleasure tonight to have speaker Coco Huggins with us. I should just say that this is the third in the series, and the first two are already available online. If you missed them and you want to see them, just visit the church's website, and you'll find them there quite easily. I'm going to hand over to Professor Mia Gray, who is a member of this congregation, and she's going to introduce Coco. I just want to tell you that the reason how we found Coco is curious. Andy, who has organized the series with me, and I both independently saw a letter from Coco in the Church Times, as you do. And it happened to be on defending somebody who was standing up for environmental justice. And we thought, oh, that's interesting. Noticed that she was in Cambridge. We thought we must get in touch with her. When we started this series, we thought, great, we'll contact Coco. Looked at her website and discovered she was actually supervised by our congregation member, Mia Gray. So, dream team we have tonight. Over to Mia.
Thanks, Jonathan. It is a delight to be here and to welcome Coco to St. Paul's. So as Jonathan said, Coco is my PhD student. She's in her fourth and final year, last few months really, of her PhD. And as part of her research, she has spent over a year interviewing MPs and lords from Parliament, talking to policymakers around the country, looking at local policymakers and local charities in place who try to mediate kind of austerity and welfare reform in different ways. It's done some wonderful work. So it's lovely to have her come and talk today about how her faith kind of really interacts with her research. It's something I've not heard either, although we talk about bits and pieces of that. Just to give you a little background for Coco, she also spent a year working for the Department of Work and Pensions. She was
3 months.
Oh, 3 months, 3 months.
I don't want to do a Rachel Reeves. So.
Okay, 3 months. It seemed a long time. As a research placement, as part of her PhD, she was seconded there. And last but not least, she is chapel warden for Pembroke College and have been very involved there and has done a number of different preaching on social justice issues, and really, I think, continued to be a really important person in that congregation in making sure that social justice issues are kind of high on the agenda. I think I could say that. It's funny, kind of, scholars at Cambridge, like many other universities, often are really encouraged to be rational thinkers, to think with their head, to bring their kind of rational self to the profession. And many of us also bring our hearts to the profession too, and make sure that the issues we care about and that we feel passionate about are the things we work on. But not all of us also bring kind of the ethics and morality and soul into what they do, and I think Coco does, and she manages to kind of bring the three together, and I think that is a real feat and something to be very proud of. So without further ado, I introduce you to Coco, pass you along.
Thank you very much, Mia. It's a real pleasure to be here in this beautiful space. I just want to say a quick prayer before I begin, if that's all right. Father God, thank you so much that we can gather in this place to come to learn about you and your love. Help us to emulate that in all we do, how we interact with each other, and how we speak. Amen. So I would quite like to open this talk by reading a passage from Acts that many people here will be very familiar with. All the believers were in one heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them and brought the money from the sales and put them at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. So this passage from Acts tells us about the beginning of the early church, what it looked like. It was a place where people were united in heart and mind, and where no one was needy. But unfortunately, that isn't the state of the UK today. We know from either from personal experience, from what we've seen in the media, that poverty and destitution have become almost a new norm. Churches have been at the forefront of bringing this to the political agenda, but across politics, we've seen an increasing concern with poverty. The idea that the poorest households would have to more than double their income to escape poverty is something that actually would have seemed quite alien to many people even 10 or 20 years ago. But at the same time, we've seen an increasing revival in the role of the church. People stepping up to fill these gaps that have been left in the social safety net. Food banks, warm hubs, baby banks. And actually, this is something that too has been rising up the agenda. Politicians are beginning to realize the role of the church and the power that it has in community to be able to fill in where the state has failed. But actually, in terms of my personal convictions, I look a lot to Martin Luther King and the framing that he has when he looks at philanthropy. Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary. So where does this leave us as Christians? After all, the idea of caring for the poor and philanthropy and caring for those in need is something that is at the very heart of the gospel. And on the one hand, it's amazing that churches have been taking on this responsibility, and there is a renewed sense that this is something that churches should be doing. But at the same time, there's a growing failure of the state to meet up to these Christian values and Christian principles that are also reflected across loads of other faiths. So I would like to provide some kind of reflections on this as someone who has spent a lot of time talking to policymakers, as Mia said, and practitioners and MPs and civil servants and people that work in think tanks, but also people that have been in grassroots movements to try and help support some of the most vulnerable people in our society today. I'm not really hoping to give you an idea of definitively in terms of policy what I think the benefit system should or shouldn't look like. I hope we can have a discussion about that later. But really think about the kind of principles that the Bible instills in us and what Christianity as a faith can help us do when it comes to both studying these things, interacting with people that might be using the system, and also how we can approach it in a kind of ideological way. But I think it's helpful to kind of ground this in where we are in the benefit system today. It's a very complicated system, and it's one that has undergone a lot of reform in the past 15 years particularly. So the UK still has actually quite enviable in many senses when we compare it to the global south and other parts of the world system of social security, of support for people of working age, but also for pensioners. But when we compare it to much of the OECD, it's lacking. So it's consistently one of the countries that has the lowest levels of earning replacement for people that are unemployed. And also in terms of pensions, we spend a lot less than comparable economies like Italy or France. So I think that's an important thing to kind of contextualize when we're talking about these issues in the UK. But since 2010, this system has undergone radical reform, quite controversial reform. So as many people will know, 6 kind of working age benefits like tax credits and job seekers allowance were integrated into a single payment called universal credit. And there were lots of other kinds of changes to eligibility, an increased sanctioning regime, and sort of enhanced conditionality for these kind of payments that people receive either when they're out of work, or they're on a low income, or they have health conditions. And when these changes were brought in, the Department for Work and Pensions said that they aimed to make the system fairer and more affordable, better able to tackle poverty, worklessness, and welfare dependency, and ensure that anyone that was on benefits who started working will be better off than they would have been on benefits. And I think what's interesting when we look at this is that there's lots of different things going on here at the same time, right? On the one hand, it's trying to tackle poverty. On another, it's trying to tackle worklessness. On another, it's trying to tackle welfare dependency. Make the system fairer and more affordable. And so actually, when we look at what's happened, I'd argue that lots of the issue is that it's trying to do too many things at the same time, and the system isn't clear in terms of its principles about what it's actually trying to achieve. Regardless of its intentions, however, the system has contributed, I would argue, and many scholars would argue, to declining living standards, rising poverty, particularly amongst children. So over a fifth of the UK population now lives in poverty, around 3 in every 10 children currently living in poverty. And of those currently in poverty, 4 in 10 are in very deep poverty. So would more than have to double their income to be above the poverty line. We've had a rise in the number of people that are in destitution, and that's defined as not being able to meet their most basic needs to be warm, clothed, and fed. And 3/4 of those who have experienced destitution are in receipt of some kind of social security benefit. So it's clear that the system isn't working in terms of alleviating poverty. But then we've also had high numbers of vacancies, but at the same time, a 2-to-1 ratio for the number of people that are seeking jobs versus the number of jobs actually available. So clearly, it's not actually alleviating worklessness among some groups either. So I basically became interested in what was going on here, what politicians thought about it, how they framed it, and how policymakers and practitioners were thinking about these reforms. So over the past 18 months, 2 years, I've interviewed over 50 different kinds of 50 individuals, which included MPs from all the major political parties, some of whom were Christian, some of whom weren't Christian, civil servants, people that work in a range of think tanks, from the Adam Smith Institute all the way to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, former deputy prime ministers, former ministers, current ministers. And so I just want to reflect, in light of that, what I've heard from them, what I think the Christian faith has to offer in the midst of this. So I want to pull out 3 kind of key things that I think, from my experiences, from talking to people, that the Christian faith can offer when we're looking at these issues. And the first is a concrete set of principles. And like I said before, I think the benefit system is lacking in terms of a coherent ideological framework that is consistent across all its parts. And while I don't think that the Bible is a policy manual, I think it is a principle manual. We can interpret principles differently in terms of a policy agenda, but they need to be consistent in terms of their principles, what they're trying to achieve, how they view people, how they value people. The second is in terms of practices, in things that Christians do, or they kind of should do as Christians, that can help us understand what a kind of functioning benefit system would look like, but also how we can try and, in the meantime, deal with some of the issues that we're facing in the benefit system. And the third is hope and imaginaries. And I think something that I consistently found was that people that were working in this sector were increasingly devoid of hope. So what I'd like to do is just go through each of these things, kind of in turn, identify the kind of problem that I've associated with them, and the kind of sort of solution that I think, or sort of bridge that Christianity can kind of offer. So the first problem that I kind of mentioned is a lack of ideological consistency and values, right? And this is something that people that I spoke to, whether they were policymakers or whether they were people in think tanks or people working in the third sector identified, that actually different parts of the system are trying to do different things. And ultimately, over time, different governments will have different agendas. And so, there's different bits of the system that have been reformed to try and do different things. And that ultimately means that the system isn't coherent. And obviously, if you were going to design the system now, it probably wouldn't look that way. And, how we then translate this into policy is a separate idea. But, whether they were in the Labour Party, or whether they were in the Conservative Party, or actually in Lib Dems. I haven't got a quote from any Lib Dems up there, but there was a recognition that actually the system isn't working, not necessarily because of lack of will, but because the structure is such that it's not consistent. And in terms of the values and principles that I think Christianity can kind of offer as a framework, I've based that on the Christian MPs, the peers, the civil servants that I've interviewed, and picked out the things that most commonly across the political spectrum were things that they identified as being important. And I've put these in kind of 3 categories. So the first is recognizing the dignity and worth of every individual made in the image of God. And that is something that I think, unfortunately, the system as it stands does not do. The second is justice and fairness. I think, I would like to think we can all agree that our God is a righteous God and is a fair God. If we want to emulate a system that is kind of Christ-like in its principles, then we also need to have an element of fairness and justice, and that also means a kind of action and consequence. And the third is allowing room for grace and forgiveness. In recognizing that every single individual is made in the image of God and has dignity, we also need to understand that every human being is inherently flawed, and we will all make mistakes. And currently, the system is not able to understand that or compute that as an entity. There isn't a lot of grace and forgiveness in the sanctioning regime, for example, for claimants when they say, for example, don't turn up to a meeting on time or miss an appointment because of a hospital appointment, for example, with a work coach. So, again, like I said, these are things that people that I've spoken to have kind of raised as things that they would want to see integral to the system. So, particularly the idea of every human being being valuable and, made in God's image. And actually, this is something that, again, across the political spectrum was something that was recognized. But what I found interesting was that they obviously came to very different conclusions about how that translated into policy, which is obviously the eternal lacuna. In terms of how we then bring in kind of justice and forgiveness and grace, one former minister in DWP discussed this in the context of sanctions, and the idea that actually it would be quite easy to implement an idea of forgiveness and grace. The idea that, okay, you have a card system like you would in a football match, for example, rather than just saying, okay, 1 strike, your benefits are docked. How about we say, okay, well, we have a yellow card system. You've done this once? Okay. How can we work through this so that this doesn't happen again? Then an orange card or a red card. So a kind of a system of acknowledging that people make mistakes, but also of helping them to grow and recognize that, and not just a kind of immediately punitive system. And again, I don't really need to reiterate that this is a biblical way of looking at things, that the Bible is full of discussion of how we are made in God's image, that we are image bearers, but also that because of that, we are one, we are united. And if we oppress someone that is less fortunate than ourselves, we also offend God, because everyone is made in his image. So again, that is a principle that I think should underline the system that maybe doesn't underline it now. We see a lot of othering, a lot of rhetoric within the system of demonization, of kind of tactics of division, of counterposing benefit claimants against the hardworking taxpayer is something that we see a lot, and actually recognizing the innate value of everyone, but also the fact that they are united and one is something that I think kind of Christian ideology can bring. And actually, in terms of having a clear and coherent set of principles, this isn't something that is beyond the scope of imagination, because we can actually look to Scotland to give us an example of the ways in which they've done this. So Scotland set up a set of social security principles. And this is something that the UK doesn't have, and actually we often forget that lots of aspects of the benefit system are devolved now within Scotland. And they decided that actually they needed to have a charter and a set of principles that would guide the way in which they approach the benefit system. And this is actually enshrined in legislation, so it's in law, it's in Scottish law. And we can see there that actually, respect and dignity comes into that. So the idea that this is a kind of fantastical thing that we could never do, we could never have a charter or a set of principles that could guide the way that the benefit system works, this kind of shows us that actually that's not the case. We could if we wanted to. The second problem that we have, which is probably the most acute problem, is the lack of the system being able to meet very, very basic needs. And that is something that is not just evident through my research, but evident through research of countless organizations, from the Trussell Trust to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And behind you are some quotes from interviews that describe what third sector workers are seeing. Within Christian framing, we can focus too much on despair or too much on hope. And actually, we need to have a balance of the two, of acknowledging and mourning the fact that the system has got this bad, and that in a country that is, something like the 5th wealthiest country in the world, that we have people that are living in this way. And so in terms of what Christianity can bring in terms of this fundamental lack of the system being able to meet basic needs, there's the practicalities element. Church is very good at this. They've done it. They did it before the welfare state. And again, you can hopefully see behind me things that people in the third sector have been taking it on themselves to do since the decline of the state. But at the same time, we shouldn't enable that retreat of the state, I don't think, because I haven't seen any evidence that actually the charity sector is able to adequately take on all those responsibilities. They don't have the resources. So in terms of practical things that Christians can do, it's also advocacy, and that's something that the church has been very, very good at. Faith groups, faith leaders have been speaking up against poverty, and that's something that has actually been a big source of interfaith action. We saw during the pandemic lots of different faith groups coming together to provide, but also to condemn the current status quo. And again, I'm just going to put up some verses there just for the sake of it, because why not? In terms of, we're in a church, in terms of the fundamental biblical basis on which this is based, and it should be at the heart of everything we do. And I think I'm not going to point to any particular countries or regimes or people, but I think we can see in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in the epistles, we see this very, very fundamental calling that we have as Christians to welcome in the stranger. And again, bringing back to the idea that we're all made in God's image and we're all one, if we don't do these things, then, we're not just damaging our fellow human being. God does not want to see us suffer. He doesn't want to see, people in our society suffer. But ultimately, we have free will and we have a choice about how we deal with these issues. And currently, we're not dealing with it in a way that I think is Christ-like. So the third problem, and that's a lack of hope. And I think this is probably the most pernicious and the most damaging that I've seen, and is the most deep-rooted. So just a couple of quotes from people there, but just the kind of, the sense of despair was used a lot, the sense of misery, the sense of not even being able to conceive of a future that's better. And endlessness, kind of living from one day to the next that, so many people are going through right now. And I think what populist movements in particular are very good at doing is imagining things and setting forward an alternative vision. And what galvanizes people is not an understanding of the present, but a vision of what the future could be like. And actually, as Christians, we we do and we should have an innate sense of hope. And Christianity is fundamentally a hopeful religion. It's one that understands the past and the sacrifice that has been made to us, but frames that in the context of looking towards a future and having a sure and certain hope. And in terms of finding hope in all of this, I think the thing that I was quite surprised by was how many people that I spoke to who would describe themselves as completely opposite on the political spectrum actually agreed with each other over things that maybe they wouldn't expect to have agreed with each other over. And I mean, we've had a talk, I think, on kind of peace building, and we're going to have another on, I think, on interfaith dialogue. But actually, in terms of hope, I think there's hope in the humanity of people. And I think in an increasingly kind of divisive landscape, we need to be thinking about, okay, well, rather than, interfaith dialogue is great, but like cross-party dialogue, people don't talk to each other. And I think the number of people who recall one story of someone who I interviewed at a very right-wing think tank, who had done some research on me and kind of said, I know the kind of person you are, blah, 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 blah. And I said, okay, well, actually, do you know X, Y, Z? And they said, oh, no. And we ended up having a really kind of productive and fruitful conversation. And that was because he had failed to recognize an element of my humanity that was shared with his, an experience that was shared with his. And that gave us the opportunity to be able to talk about something in a way that I didn't expect. So in terms of hope, I think there is hope in the midst of this, and that's not just coming from a Christian perspective. If we look at the way in which absolute poverty all over the world has fallen, it is possible. We've done this on a global scale in terms of improving people's living standards. Okay, global inequality has increased, but in terms of the number of people that have kind of come out of absolute poverty, that's fallen. So we do have a kind of track record of being able to do this. We've raised living standards before. So I think, again, as a faith that looks to the past but uses that as a reassurance for the future, I think we can take a lot from that. And so I want to kind of close by thinking about Revelation and the image of the world that Revelation gives us. The idea that everything will be made new, that God will wipe away every tear from our eyes, and there'll be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things will have passed away. And I think the idea of a new hope is something that we need to hold on to, and we can't let go of it. And that's the note that I'd like to end on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Coco. That was really thought-provoking. I loved both that notion of the importance of dignity, which I think, the kind of lack of dignity is something we see so much in this whole debate about what low-income people should be facing, and to kind of give dignity and to demand dignity, I think, is so important. And also that sense of hope. I think that was very thought-provoking. I think of the ways in which, we're not talking about blind optimism, but to have a shared dialogue and a shared sense of humanity. These are not unreachable things, right? So both very important. Can I open the floor up to questions for Coco?
Yeah.
And one thing I love is often a talk goes all the way up to the end and you have 5 minutes to squeeze in questions. How nice to actually have time for questions. So thank you for that. Questions from the floor. Andrew.
Thank you. Is it working? Yes. That was a very interesting talk. I'm impressed that you've spent time in DWP and you've spoken to people who have some say in how we organize these things, but I'm curious how you sort of use your Christian framework when presumably most of the people you're talking to don't work by that framework, are not familiar with the language. So I guess it has to be something that structures your thinking, but how do you sort of translate that? You've spoken to some MPs, evidently some of them were Christian MPs. Well, that's easy. Yeah. We're easy because we're on board, but probably most of the people are not on board with this language. So what do you do?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I think in my day-to-day interactions with people, I, rightly or wrongly, tend not to use kind of Christian language. I think, interestingly, a lot of people that worked in DWP when these changes were coming through were Christian. So Ian Duncan-Smith was a Christian. Lots of senior people in the Liberal Democrats at the time were Christians. So much so that it was colloquially known as the Department for Worship and Prayer. So, I think that there is a long history of Christians working in this sector. But I think in terms of how I interact with people, I think I tend to try and embody those values, and then other people see them. So in terms of how I then, if I go up and spend some time with a third sector organization, treating them as an equal partner, listening to what they want, trying to understand issues from their perspective. And I think I don't sort of impose this framework on the people that I speak to. I don't talk to them about it. It's just something that I try and enact myself when I'm interacting with people. But I think also, even if they're not Christians, a lot of the people that were doing this work in the third sector weren't Christians. They were kind of enacting it anyway, which I think is really interesting. So lots of the people that were working in community centres that had food banks or were advice workers were, whether they knew it or not, enacting these fundamental Christian principles of recognizing everyone's basic humanity and dignity, of trying to give people hope. So I think, in a way, I didn't question that a lot of the people, particularly on the ground, understood these things because they were already enacting them. In terms of higher level policymakers, I'm trying to understand the way that they think, not try and change the way that they think. Changing the way that they think is maybe another step. So it's not kind of up to me to judge the way that they frame these issues. I'm just trying to understand it. So I don't put forward, when I'm interviewing an MP, I don't say this is what I think. I'm trying to understand how they think. So in a way, that what you were saying doesn't, in a way, really come into it, because actually it's not about me, it's about them. And I hope that in the way that I interact with them and the respect that I show for some of their beliefs that are very, very different from mine, that they get a piece of the values that I just spoke about, if that makes sense.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. I mean, it's quite challenging, isn't it, to consider how many people are living in poverty. I'm just wondering, is it just about money? Is it just that you escape poverty if you are provided with sufficient money, or is it something much more than that? Because the government, no doubt, even now, would say we give people quite a lot of money in terms of social security. What is the sort of the magic that goes along with providing enough money? And are you really saying, we just need to the government just needs to put more money into social security?
Yeah, and I think that's a question that has been debated a lot, whether poverty is just a lack of money or whether it's a lack of aspiration, or whether all of these kind of social determinants of health and things like that. I think I would bring it back to the three principles, right? So what you're talking about in terms of the lack of money is the lack of need to meet your basic necessities. And I think, I think poverty would be a lack of all of those things, in a way. It would be a lack of hope. It would be a lack of an ability to meet your most basic needs as well, but also a lack of being treated with dignity and respect. And I think it's very difficult to have hope, and it's very difficult to in a way be treated with dignity in the society that we live in without that basic ability to meet your basic needs. If you're having to go to a food bank or all of these other kinds of things, or not being able to afford toiletries or things that help you kind of stay clean, or all of these other kinds of things. I think it fundamentally comes down to a lack of people being able to meet their most basic needs. And I think if we look at...
Is that about money?
I think it is, yeah. And I think if we look at, like I said before, in terms of the amount of money that we actually spend on it, it's less than most comparable OECD countries. So the basic level of universal credit, when I last checked, was just under £100 a week if you were over 25 and a single person. And I would challenge most people to be able to live on that amount of money, when a coffee costs like £3.50. And a pint of milk is, £1 or whatever it is now. So I think I'm not convinced that the current amount that people get in the most basic amount is able to sustain a basic standard of living, and I think that that's something that charities have called for. And in terms of how conditional we make that, the requirements that people need to go through to be able to get that, I think, I don't think that the system is overly generous as it is, either for people of working age or for people of pension age. Our pensions are much lower than countries like France and Italy. Again, in terms of income replacement, we can expect to get, on average, less than 20% of our standard level of income if you become unemployed, and then you end up on benefits. So in other countries like Germany, it's more of an insurance-based system, so you then get a proportion of your previous income. In the UK, if you have, you're only entitled to universal credit if you have savings below a certain amount, which I think is about £8,000. If it's, and then there's no kind of relationship to your previous level of income. There's nothing in the UK that ties what you get to your previous level of income, which means that you kind of have a massive drop. There's a big kind of cliff edge. So I think, yes, if people don't have those most basic needs met, they're not going to be able to get out the system. Because ultimately, if you're trying to get a job, but you can't afford to buy a bus ticket, or you can't take the time off work to go to a doctor, and your health gets worse, and then you lose your job. That's a very common story that we hear. Or you're in your mid-50s, and you break your hip, and you're waiting for a hip replacement, and you can't work. Ultimately, if we had an NHS system that was functioning, and you got your hip replacement, you could probably go back to work. And there's lots of people, particularly in their kind of early 50s, for whom that is the case, or they're waiting for routine treatment. So if we're looking at something like PIP, which has been in the news a lot, lots of that rise has been attributed to long waiting lists for treatment. So yeah, in short, I think it is, it's a lack of basic need. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks again for the talk. It was great, really interesting talk, Coco. So the system, the political system is essentially secular. Would you? That's the first part of my question.
Okay.
I mean, I'm kind of guessing it's framed in a secular manner, and the policies are made without reference to God, any God, any whatever belief you come from. But a lot of the people that you talked to consider themselves Christian, or profess to be Christians. But based on what you're talking about, would you really say that the system as it is and the people who design the system are essentially unchristian?
Okay, well, the first thing I would say is, who am I to judge another man's servant? I am not in a position to be able to say who is Christian, whether a system is unchristian or not Christian. Ultimately, that is with God, and God's judgment is above mine. I think part of it comes back to the conflicting thing that we were talking about earlier, that you can have something that seems like a really good idea in principle, like merging loads of benefits into one so it's easier to apply for. Great, that's a great idea. It's simpler, brilliant. But then if you combine that with something else, like, I don't know, the Treasury wanting to cut costs, then you have a kind of clash. So I don't doubt the integrity of people that have worked in this system to try and achieve something, or their values or their morals. I think the problem is that it's clashing with conflicting things. And that's, you know, it's easy to say, oh, well, wouldn't it be great if we just design the system in like a coherent way? It's probably not going to happen. But I think that that's the root of the problem. I don't question one person's individual morals and one person's individual morals, but when those come together, I think. In terms of it being kind of fundamentally unchristian, like I said, it's not really up for me to judge whether it is, but I would bring it back to those kind of principles that I identified that I think underline the Christian faith, and I think it's up to an individual to decide whether they think it is Christian or not Christian, based on whether it meets that in their own experience.
Sorry, I'm not going to put you on the spot about that.
No,
again.
that's fine.
No, I suppose, but there clearly must be a debate, I mean, even within the church, about what constitutes the right way to support people, and in terms of what you know, where people find themselves in terms of their economic and social circumstances.
Oh yeah, definitely. The church isn't a monolith. But I think in a way the first step is to agree on those principles, because I think without those principles as an anchor, the kind of the questions of policy can't really be debated. If you're debating on, you know, if you're debating on fundamentals, everything else is going to be irrelevant. So if you can at least decide, okay, these are the basic principles, how do we, in a way, support that with evidence? How you know, how do people feel when they go through the system? Do they feel like they have dignity? Do they feel like they're respected? How can we then, on the basis of evidence, then judge how to make that system better? Okay, we want, you know, people to be able to have this basic standard of living. Right, okay, let's work out what the basic standard of living is. Cool, let's do that. Okay, there's going to be questions about what is need and the construction of what need is. And I think there's lots of debates about absolute poverty versus relative poverty and all these other kinds of things. And okay, cool. We think that there should be hope within the system, that people can feel like they can get out of the system. Okay, what within the system are we actually doing to help people feel like they can escape the system, both from a practical perspective, but also from a kind of motivational perspective of perceiving their lives as something else. So I think, whilst I definitely agree that from a policy perspective, there's differences in terms of what it should look like. If we're able to take it back to those principles and anchor it within that, then that at least gives us a basis on which to be able to model the system based on what people tell us, what researchers tell us, to be able to model the system in a way that kind of is better resembling all the things that I discussed.
Hi. Thank you. I'd be interested in hearing more about something you touched on briefly about the balance that we get between increasing the welfare state away from the workfare one that we have at the moment, and then also wanting to empower third sector organizations to do that work in communities, and how we get that balance right, and particularly then as well thinking what the role of churches is in comparison to other third sector and grassroots organizations. What do churches have to offer from a welfare perspective that's distinctive?
Yeah, brilliant. I think the first step I would say in that is listen to the people that are being affected. So I think, you know, it's trying to listen and understand what people that are within the system would like, what people that are working in the third sector think is important. And I think that that's the first step, because ultimately, again, in terms of third sector provision, if we're looking at, I spent a bit of time in Liverpool looking at the way in which third sector organisations had taken on community centres and public libraries and all that kind of thing. And actually, lots of people said that they preferred it when it was run by the community. So we're thinking, okay, well, what aspects of the community provision are good? What do people like? What works? But also, how can we fund that sustainably? So I think the first step is listening and trying to understand, and not, impose either solution, because I think people tend to be quite black or white. They either think, yeah, the state is great, municipalism, let's do it, let's nationalize everything, or they think the state is bad, we need to remove the state and then everything will be great. I think particularly Christians often end up in either camp. I think, in a way, I like to view the state as if it were a church, in the sense that we are all part of it, we should all belong to it, we all have a sense of ownership of it, we come together in it. And if you model the state as you would a church, I mean, the idea of the modern state is actually quite rooted in the way that the churches used to work, where you paid a tithe, and then if you were sick or you were in need, the church would look after you. And I think the state as a principle, or how I think a state should function, should kind of emulate the principles of a church, in terms of that you are part of a community and you can contribute to the community, but you also belong to something bigger than yourself. Like when you live in Britain, you're not just you, but you also belong to this bigger community. So I think it's not a kind of either or. I think if we, again, it depends on your political persuasions, but I don't think it should be the church that is providing that baseline level of money, because that should be something that comes from everybody. And although the church is great at doing these kind of things, there's multiple faith institutions in the UK, and then how would you then kind of conceive of that? The state, I'm convinced, is the best unit to be able to do this, because it is, a central unit. I think in terms of local support, that's something that churches are very good at, because they're embedded in the community. They are a ready-made public space that exists, that people can access for free. And so in terms of kind of more sort of pastoral type stuff, that's literally where we get the word pastoral from. Great, like I have no qualms with that, but it's about it being properly funded, and I do think that should be funded by the state. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't value individual philanthropy, and that people shouldn't give or be compelled to give, either by their faith or by other reasons, to good causes, but there needs to be a baseline. And it comes back to recognizing that everyone is made in the image of God, but also that everyone is broken and fundamentally flawed. And that means that sometimes we're not going to do the right thing. And that we need an element in us that compels us to do the right thing sometimes. Sometimes we can do that of our own volition, but sometimes we do need a system that encourages us to do that. And that's how I view taxes. Like, tax is basically a tithe, right? To be able to provide for people. But it's not really viewed in that way. Yes, I am rambling, but thank you for your question. Hopefully that's a bit helpful.
What do you think about universal income?
I think, again, it's a great idea in principle. The issue is that in terms of, and I mean, the evidence does look good on a small scale. To bring it back to the evidence, there's been trials in Wales for care leavers that look very promising. I think it could be good in a targeted way, but I think the issue is you either have it at a level that is too low such that it doesn't really actually make that much of a difference, or it's too high, in which case it's not necessarily affordable in the current political regime. In an ideal world, maybe, but is not affordable. So I think we could move towards something more like that, but I don't think it's something that is conceivable. But then, like, as Christians, we're here for hope and imaginaries. So maybe heaven looks like universal income. I don't know, I haven't been. But
has it been tried anywhere?
I think in places in Scandinavia it has. I only am aware of the UK-based ones, which are for care leavers in Wales, for a very small select group of people. And there it was designed to, essentially because if people don't have parents or guardians, they don't have anyone that would, if they went to university or, if they were renting somewhere for the first time, could kind of help them out with a deposit or that kind of thing, or have that financial backing. So in that circumstance, in the Welsh circumstance, it was designed to try and enact, because in that situation, the state is effectively the parent or guardian, right, for people that are leaving care. So in that specific instance, it's been very successful in terms of what it would be like rolled out, I don't know. But I would be personally for a universal basic income for care leavers, because I think the way that intergenerational wealth is the way that currently is, if you don't have parents that are able to financially support you, you're kind of stuffed. Or, not stuffed, but it's much, much more difficult. And I don't think that, through no fault of your own, if you're in care, and the state is then your parent or guardian, that you should be put at a disadvantage because of that. So in that circumstance, I'd be 100% before it.
Great talk. Yeah, great talk, Coco. I guess I'm, as well as being a Christian, I'm a bit of a techno-optimist.
Nice.
And I wonder, I think about inefficiencies in systems. I mean, going back to really the start of the Q&A when you were talking about, or I think Fiona or Andrew were asking about whether there's just more money needed to improve the standards of welfare. That makes me wonder whether there's inefficiencies, there must be some inefficiencies in the system, or whether there's glaring ones that could be improved. And I wonder if, from your perspective, having interviewed many people, what you think about that, about opportunities to make these systems more efficient.
I think there's always inefficiencies. I think I would caution in terms of the principle that I laid out in terms of dignity and respect. I would say lots of the digitalization efforts that we've seen have actually gone against that. Because it's become increasingly impersonal and inhuman. People, don't really talk to people face to face within the department. People don't really have names. You have the kind of decision maker as this kind of Orwellian figure that makes decisions about your claims. And so I think technology is great in many ways. I think having digital records is very good, for example, because it means that if you move to a different part of the country, then all records are on a central system. Great. But in terms of communicating with people, I think we actually maybe need to move away from that a bit. If you're going into a job center, you have something like 10 minutes with a work coach. I don't know how you're expected to understand the depths of the problems that people are going through or their experiences in 10 minutes. So I think some of these, in terms of costs, we actually need to spend more money on to then ultimately save more money later. I think a lot of these things, a lot of the focus on kind of efficiency drives has actually cost us more money through more mistakes, for example. So if we look at something like PIP that's been in the news, 48% of PIP claims get rejected. Right, that's actually, quite a lot, something like 48%. So only about half of people that apply for PIP actually get PIP. But then if we look at the number of people that do get PIP on appeal, most of them do. But the number of stages that you then have to go through to then get it, you have to have a mandatory reconsideration, and then you have to go to an appeal and all these kinds of things. So actually, something that is meant to improve efficiency by making the system quicker, by having a tick box system that is very black and white. We're like, yes, efficiency, technology, amazing, great. But what it actually means is that it costs the taxpayer more money because they're having to go through an appeal stage. And actually, if you spend a little bit more time, a little bit more money in the first instance, then you're going to save money in the long run. And also you kind of recognize people's sort of individual dignity and their humanity, which I also want to just emphasize that we speak about DWP as a monolith, or the organization as a monolith. Again, it's not just about the people that are within the system that we recognize as having dignity and humanity, but also people that are in that system that are working under very difficult circumstances, that often are on 0-hours contracts themselves, that are poorly paid, that don't have time. Some of them may also be claiming the same benefits that they're trying to help people with. And actually, on both sides, there's massive demonization of both people that claim benefits. And again, I'm creating a monolith and homogenizing people, but yes, for the purposes of this argument, I'm going to. But then also demonizing the institution when it's not a black box. There's people in there that are trying to do really good things. There's individual work coaches that are really trying to do their best and support people. So yeah, just to reiterate that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. And I think maybe because I'm one, I couldn't help to notice the absence of the issue of immigrants. Because when I got my first visa, my first BRP card, no benefits. It was right there. So what's your instance when we, immigrants, are being used as scapegoats for the political parties or whatever political agenda they have. So what do you think in terms of principles and actions, as you presented in the beginning, can be taken to incorporate immigrants into the system of benefits?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think it, and I kind of put some verses up there that I think speak to these kind of issues. The Bible is very clear, I think, that we should welcome, quote unquote, the stranger as a native. It says it in Jeremiah, it says it in Leviticus, it says it everywhere in the Gospels. So I think that those principles don't just apply to people that are citizens, they apply to everybody. And I think you then think, okay, well, how do we translate that into a policy perspective? And that is a separate issue. But I think the immigration system as it stands, you could say exactly the same thing. Almost exactly the same thing. Or the asylum system, of the fact that it's not taking into account individual people's dignity or their humanity. It's, not providing their most basic needs. Okay, we think that, oh yeah, it's great, we're housing all these asylum seekers in hotels. Isn't that nice? I would really like to live in a hotel for ages. But actually, you don't have an oven, you don't have a fridge. If you're it's something like £7 a week, you're meant to provide all your kind of basic things that you're meant to live off. If you're living in one room with 3 kids, you can't expect people to have hope. You can't expect people to have those kind of basic needs met if they're living in that environment. I think in terms of how we can incorporate people, I think the single biggest change that everyone can make immediately is language. And I think that people underestimate the power of language to both hurt people, but also to perpetuate norms that are not okay. So the idea of an illegal immigrant, for example, is one that is just actually, in terms of international law, not correct. The idea that actually there's not such a thing as an illegal asylum seeker. You have the right to claim asylum. In terms of the framing of issues, we talk about small boats. If we look at the number of legal immigrants, okay, it's something like 400,000 in the past years, which is a massive fall. But if we look at the number of people that arrived in small boats, it's something like 15,000, and yet that is perceived as a much greater problem. So why is it? Why is it that we perceive that as somehow a much bigger problem? Is it because we see it? Is it because we don't see as many people that arrive in small boats, so it's very much easier to kind of demonize them as other because we're not seeing them, we don't speak to them, whereas someone who is a quote-unquote immigrant, like you've come in here to speak to us today, but I don't think we've got anyone here who's arrived on a small boat. So language, I think, and in the way that we interact with people. And I think, in a way, I think a lot of this and a lot of the rhetoric and scapegoating, like we say, comes from the fact that people feel like they don't have a secure sense of identity, their public services aren't working, all of these other kinds of things. So if we look at the way that the country was, say, I don't know, 20 years ago, let's say, people didn't really care as much about immigration. And it's really interesting to think about why that is the case. Is it because they had an NHS that was working, or things didn't seem so bad? There was more of a safety net. People didn't feel as precarious. Maybe, incomes were rising, people could pay their mortgages, all these kinds of things. The world wasn't imploding. We weren't worried about World War III as much. But now people are worried about it because they feel their own sense of insecurity. And it's like you were saying, in terms of scapegoating, it's easier to demonize the person that is other, the person that isn't like us. So yeah, in terms of how we change that, I think language. I think that as individual people, that's the most immediate thing that we can do. But then again, at the Last Supper, Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me." So we also need to do things, and it's up to us what we do. But yeah, that's all I can really say.
Great, we are out of time. What a great conversation. I want to thank the audience for being so active and really engaging with Coco's talk. And Coco, we want to thank you for coming in and provoking such a fabulous discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
We have tea and coffee and biscuits over there. And thank you to the whole team who has made today possible, Jonathan and Vivian and Andy. Thank you. Great. Please join us for tea and coffee and a biscuit. Thank you, Coco.
Thanks.